Hello, and welcome to Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning, a higher education podcast from the Center for Teaching and Learning at Columbia University. I'm Amanda Irvin, the Center's Executive Director. In this podcast series, we explore dead ideas in teaching and learning, beliefs that, despite being untrue, continue to shape educational systems and practices. These outdated notions, as Diane Pike described, perpetuate the tyranny of dead ideas. Join us as we challenge these misconceptions and explore innovative approaches to higher education. Welcome, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Mike Whitenton. Mike is Director of Academic Initiatives at Interfaith America, where he leads Interfaith America's national curriculum and capacity building efforts to position faculty as institutional leaders for pluralism in both campus, life, and the classroom. Before joining Interfaith America, he spent a decade as an award-winning faculty member at Baylor University, specializing in interfaith cooperation, bridge building, rhetoric, and religion. He also co-founded and directed Baylor's Bridge Building Fellows Program, which equips faculty and students to advance civic pluralism on campus. A widely published scholar, Mike's research explores the intersections of rhetoric, cognitive science, and religious narrative. Mike, welcome to Dead Ideas. I'm super excited to have you with us today.
Happy to be here, Amanda.
So, where to begin, Mike? I guess we should tell the listeners at home that you and I met last summer because the Columbia CTL is participating in Interfaith America's inaugural Teaching and Learning Pluralism cohort, and we're super excited to be included. And we're included with 4 other CTLs across the country. So as part of this work together, we spent 4 or so days together in Chicago at the Interfaith America Summit doing a pluralism teaching and learning deep dive. And I will confess, you know this, of course, but I'll confess to our listeners at home that before that crash course, I knew very little about pluralism. I heard it referenced a few times over the last couple of years. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed asking if pluralism is the next DEI. There was also a New York Times article saying that pluralism or pluralists are going to, quote unquote, fix America. And I read those articles, but I never really finished them with a good sense of what pluralism is or how it might relate to teaching and learning. I did spend some time thinking about how those ideas would apply to the classroom, but they never seemed so different from inclusive teaching efforts or work that folks do on college campuses to foster belonging in the classroom. I did an interesting, and I would recommend this to listeners at home. I would say that my first meaningful engagement with Interfaith America's discussion of pluralism was when I heard Eboo Patel, Interfaith America's founder and president, speak about embracing pluralism in higher ed on the Ed Up Provost podcast, which, if you haven't heard it, highly recommend. So before you and I met, Mike, that was my foundation for understanding. And I would say since that time, it's been quite a journey to think about the ways that pluralism can be useful and employed on campuses to help support connection across and within difference in really productive and meaningful ways. So what is Interfaith America? And then what is your understanding of pluralism? Because we're a teaching and learning podcast, maybe we can apply it to teaching and learning. Do you want to start with what is Interfaith America?
Thank you so much, Amanda. I really appreciate you sharing your story of how you got involved with pluralism and how you kind of came to it. Sharing stories is part and parcel with doing pluralism work, so I think it's apropos that you started there. Interfaith America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to bridging divides. We've been around for about 25 years, first as Interfaith Youth Corps, and more recently as Interfaith America. Our mission statement is that we activate leaders to build an interfaith America, like an interfaith America, the country, the nation. We apply that, so we have a strategy statement as well that might help kind of bring that to life. Applying the principles of interfaith leadership, we equip leaders to create institutional cultures where people respect, relate, and cooperate across difference. And we think if we do all that really well, it'll look something like this, that America embraces the power of pluralism where we cooperate across differences for the common good.
I have found the respect, relate, cooperate framework super valuable in my understanding. I even posed the question as I was telling my coming of age story as it relates to pluralism, of trying to parse how pluralism and something like inclusive teaching might be a little different. And that framework has been really helpful. It's not that they are necessarily distinct in that way, but the idea that not only do we respect each other and our differences, but that we also try to mutually come together across difference and do it intentionally to create something good or better or different and work together because we might not disagree. Maybe you could correct my understanding, but I have found that actually very illuminating and powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a great overview of Interfaith America, and I think we're verging on a discussion of pluralism. Would you be willing to unpack pluralism for those of us who are on a journey of understanding what that is and how it relates to the way that we move through the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people have, everybody's got a different starting point with pluralism. For me, my PhD is in religion. And so my inroad to pluralism was Diana Eck and the Pluralism Project at Harvard. A whole lot of us got into the discussion through her and her exceptional work there. But the concept is much older than that. So if we think back, way back to the early 20th century, to the days of the melting pot metaphor. So Israel Zangwill writes a play called The Melting Pot that popularizes this idea of cultural assimilation. Now, in response to that, Horace Callan argues for cultural pluralism. So he's influenced by his advisor William James here, who believed that the universe was plural, not singular. Right? Callan Callan envisions a society where individuals could maintain their cultural identities rather than blend into a single mold. And then later, thinkers like Elaine Locke will expand on these ideas. So my point is just to say at the start that Interfaith America, we are an organization that helps people connect across religious divides, right? Also political and social divides. So it'd be easy to hear pluralism and think, oh, this is only a religious thing. I mean, it's a much bigger phenomena than that. That includes also bridging religious divides. When we talk about pluralism as an organization, we think of it as a framework. So we have this respect, relate, cooperate framework. And maybe it'd be useful for me to unpack those three pieces right now. So the first is respect. Respect across diverse identities and divergent ideologies, including the differences you don't like. Right. And so for me personally, that hits home. A lot of the spaces I'm in, we're like, yeah, diversity, we love it. And often we don't actually mean the differences we don't like. Also, we just have this kind of preset of the differences we like, and we want to celebrate those. And that's great. Obviously, that's wonderful. But here we're talking about respect, even for the differences you don't like. Not agreement, but respect. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. So there's respect, and then there's relate, right? So that's building relationships that are genuinely and mutually inspiring. So we can be enriched by one another, we believe, even when our values or perspectives diverge remarkably. And then the last piece is cooperate. So cooperation in service of the common good. We want to ask in these situations, like, what things can we work on together, even while we disagree deeply on some other things? So we're fond of saying, like, it is possible for us to fundamentally disagree about matters of ultimate concern on some things and also cooperate on the basis of what we do share in common for the common good, right? So that's respect, relate, cooperate. One quick note about respect, right? So here we really are talking about respect at the level of behavior. We're not going to affirm or love everybody's perspective. This isn't some kind of kumbaya moment where we all pretend that really we don't have any differences. And if we could just, see each other in the right light, everybody's view is equal. That's not it at all. We're just not going to affirm everybody's position. And that's normal and human. But what we are saying is we're going to commit to acting respectfully toward everyone, even when they hold views that we don't like, that we find offensive, right? So respect, relate, cooperate. So we say around here, easy to say, hard to do. That's pluralism for us.
That's a super helpful overview, Mike. I was talking about pluralism just yesterday with some colleagues, and I was going through the respect, relate, cooperate framework. And I wish I had your voice more firmly in the back of my mind like I do now. But I even ended it by saying, if that seems like a tall order, like, yeah, that's a tall order. That's like daily showing up and committing to doing this.
It's a practice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a practice, and it seems like a practice well worth doing, for sure. Okay, so we the Columbia CTL, and you and me, we are engaged in this teaching and learning pluralism cohort. Based on everything you've told us about Interfaith America and pluralism, how did you all you obviously see an application to the classroom, and I do too.
Yeah.
But I would love to hear you talk through of your thinking of like why a teaching and learning for pluralism with pluralism cohort, and what application do you see for teaching and learning in the pluralism framework?
Yeah. Wonderful question. So we think a lot about strategy and impact. We're trying to create cultures of pluralism across whole universities, right? And so we have teams that are focused on working with senior leaders and teams that are focused on working with students and also staff, right? The work I oversee works with faculty and the people who support them directly. And so we, for a long time, have had curriculum grants of some kind where we fund folks to teach courses on pluralism. We fund, for instance, we have a civic pluralism in the core curriculum grant, but we wanted to move beyond kind of a laser focus only on working with individual faculty to working with faculty on their own campus directly, and also kind of setting the pace for what excellent teaching looks like on their universities. I was on a campus for 10 years, and when I wanted to know what our university thought excellent teaching was, I turned to the CTL there. And so we view working with CTLs as a strategic move to help shift cultures on campus toward pluralism.
That's great. Thank you. I can imagine a ton of application of the respect, relate, cooperate framework in a teaching and learning setting. We do a lot of work with instructors in our teaching community to talk about, creating a climate where all students feel like they belong, where all students feel like they can have a voice, they have a seat at the table, and that work is intentional and it's hard. And having more tools in our toolbox to help us do that is incredible. Something that I referenced a little bit earlier is the distinction between work in inclusive teaching or DEI efforts and this respect, relate, cooperate framework and pluralism. Like, I imagine a Venn diagram, right? And I see a lot of overlaps between DEI work that happens on campus, inclusive teaching work that comes out of centers for teaching and learning and other units like them, and then pluralism. And I'm curious if you also see it as an overlapping Venn diagram or something else. Or where do the connections or the places where it's important to be distinct? Where do those lie for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. It's one we hear a lot. And to answer your question briefly, like, yeah, I do. I think that absolutely are overlapping Venn diagrams. All three of those practices are trying to bring more people to the table, more people to feel included in the classroom, right? So in that way, in kind of a big picture, like absolutely overlapping Venn diagrams. So I want to acknowledge, though, at the kind of the outset that DEI isn't a single thing. Like we kind of talk about it like it is all the time, like I do too, but it's a broad and diverse set of commitments and practices. And because of that, I try to avoid even defining DEI or defining pluralism against DEI or anything like that, because any attempt to do that inevitably oversimplifies and misrepresents the work. So, what I think might be useful instead is maybe I could talk a little bit more about paint a clearer picture of what pluralism looks like in the classroom or could look like in the classroom. And then let you or the listeners at home decide for yourselves whether or not like how that fits within inclusive teaching patterns or DEI, because we work with enough DEI professionals to know that that work looks different all over the place. How does that sound?
I love this. Let's do it.
So pluralism is about creating spaces where people can engage across deep differences through respect, relationships, and cooperation. We see that work is complementary to many DEI efforts. And what we tend to do is invite faculty and campus leaders, and we do, again, work with a lot of DEI administrators to explore how those approaches connect in their own context. In practical terms, I imagine maybe we can link to the pedagogies of pluralism in the show notes. In practical terms, that means infusing teaching with intentional practices like empathy, active listening, story sharing, perspective taking, creating classroom opportunities where students can engage across meaningful lines of difference. So, not just giving them the skills, but also critically giving them experiences of connecting across difference. It is such a different thing. In my own life, it was such a different thing when I learned these skills. And then I actually had the experience of being like, oh, wow, I didn't understand why. So, these kinds of skills help us understand why something that feels so scary, like a view or that feels so scary to me personally, can feel like comfy and assuring to somebody else. You can't really get there without actually connecting with people who believe differently and seeing that, they're a person just like me with all the same desires and fears, and we come to different places, and that's not insignificant, but man, we share so much in common. So it would look like connecting to skills and experiences. We also draw on case studies as a way for students to apply these skills in a real world context. We love case studies because it gives students the opportunity to really mess up bad without hurting anybody, right? Like they're just talking through a real scenario, but they're not actively working in the community to address that scenario. They can make a misstep and nobody gets hurt. We also encourage folks to connect this work with the American intellectual tradition of pluralism. The reason we do that, by the way, is because the challenges we face here are deeply rooted in our own national context. So we think it's useful to be like, well, here's a bunch of folks from within the American intellectual tradition who have been working on this for a really long time. Both the folks that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, but also there's a whole stream of scholarship, and I'm sure maybe I can send that bibliography to upload as well. So with pluralism, the outcome we're working toward is a campus where all students feel like they belong, not because differences are being erased or censored or self-censored, but because they're actively engaged constructively. So imagine a classroom where students from every background, religious, non-religious, across political and social spectrums, develop real respect, authentic relationships, and collaborative partnerships as they navigate course material, right? So all of this needs to be relevant to the course material. And when we do this well, it contributes to something bigger. So we get increased understanding, decreased prejudice, shared narratives that hold a diverse society together, continuity of identity communities without isolation, bridges of social capital to solve problems, and strengthen civic cohesion. So pluralism is not about ignoring differences at all. It's about connecting through them and building civic goods that make democracy work.
What a way to prepare students for the world,
We
you know?
think so. We're at a genuinely unprecedented time in terms of affective polarization. So, affective polarization is a measure of how we feel toward people that we perceive to be different than us. And it's never been higher, right? We've never felt more divided. Lots of research shows we're not actually as divided as we think, but if we just focus on how we feel, we've never felt more divided. What better time to prepare students to connect across people they think they disagree with? And sometimes those disagreements are profound. Sometimes you just made assumptions. We all make them, right?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so I have another question for you. We have had a great conversation about the application of pluralism in the classroom, and I think there are a thousand more things that we could talk about together, but at the very least, I feel like we've painted a really rich picture of what this could look like potentially, and maybe even people who are listening are excited to learn more. Check us out. So, one of the areas, even though I'm still forming my own opinions and thoughts about this, one of the areas where I sometimes sense a little pushback or trepidation from folks when we start talking about the application of pluralism in the classroom goes back to something we were talking about the faith-based or religious-based tradition of pluralism. And just, I don't want to say like a slight discomfort with that, but a little like maybe trepidation is the word that I would use, because unless you're at a religiously affiliated institution or teaching in religious studies, religion or faith isn't often something that comes up in the classroom. And given pluralism's history as a faith-based framework, I'm curious how we approach this, and I'll also mention you and I have talked a lot about civic or political
Yeah.
ways to approach pluralism and making sure that there is space for that here in that conversation. So, how do we approach these conversations, Mike? What are all the answers?
A wonderful question, Amanda. So I think that this might actually be a dead idea, right? Not just about religion in the classroom. I think that it's kind of part of a larger, what I think is a dead idea, that students can or should bracket their own experiences, perspectives, identities when they step into a learning space, right? So, in a former life as an academic, I did a lot of work with cognitive science. That's just not the way the brain works. We can't do that, right? Like we can try, but we can't. And so I do think that this may be a dead idea. I think if we zoomed out for a moment, think about the kind of broader context that might be useful. So like recent research, relatively recent research from Constructive Dialogue Institute and More in Common from 2023, which was a simpler time, right? Like it was a high stress time, but it was a simpler time in higher ed, indicated that most students, most self censored at meaningful levels out of concern for being canceled by their peers. And also, they were concerned about hurting their classmates' feelings, which can we just like have a moment for that? It's kind of sweet, right? I appreciate that. We also, as professor for a long time, I can imagine that they're also worried about retribution from their professors. And so they're self censoring, right? And self censorship is generally bad for learning, right? Like if you're not bringing your full self to the classroom, then probably you're leaving something on the table, as it were. Pluralist pedagogy invites students to bring their whole selves into the classroom in relevant ways, right? That might include their worldview or religious identity. It could also include political commitments or other aspects of who they are. It's not, just to be clear, this is not about imposing religion, right? It's just about recognizing that every student has a complex worldview, an ethical framework that shapes how they engage with big questions. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about like actual scenarios in classrooms, but maybe one more would be useful. So, let's say you're teaching a course on ethics and you're discussing end of life questions, right? So you're going to go through these hard, tense topics. Beginning that unit by inviting students to share a story that helps the class understand how they relate to these questions could go a long way toward building trust, making perspectives legible, and deepening engagement before the hard conversations even begin. Right. So that same exercise would hold up across disciplines, course on civil rights, constitutional law, even ancient philosophy. I taught some ancient philosophy. This comes up a lot. Of course, you could avoid all that. It definitely would be easier, but you'd miss out on a huge amount of insight and experiences that students are already bringing with them. And that's the opportunity that pluralism creates, right? So learning that connects through difference, not by erasing it.
Mike, I cannot thank you enough for joining us. And I also can't think of a better place to end our conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about all things pluralism and pedagogy. I feel like I have learned a lot through our discussion. I'm just constantly in a space of learning a lot from you. And I'm just so very grateful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. And thank you for your work. I mean, Columbia is fortunate to have you in the CTL doing exceptional work on campus.
Oh, we appreciate that. Thanks, Mike.
Hi there. I'm Mark Raymond, Senior Learning Experience Designer at the Columbia Center for Teaching and Learning. If you've enjoyed this episode, we've gathered all the resources and links we mentioned today over at our website. You can find everything at ctl.columbia.edu/podcast. Now, while you're there, or if you're listening on the go, please take a moment to give us a thumbs up, rate us, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite shows. Your feedback really does mean the world to us, and we truly appreciate your support. Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning is produced by Stephanie Ogden, Sarah Carswell, Lauren Close, and Michael Brown. Our theme music is In the Lab by Immersive Music.